morning, everyone. Welcome to the Conclave of Mages and Sages. Unfortunately, one of our panellists, Marion Womack, couldn't make it because she has COVID. Good reason to stay away. So, good morning, and let's do our introductions. Let's start just to my left.
Hi, I'm Emma Chende. I write science fiction and fantasy. I've had short stories published in various places, Ceaseless Skies, Fantasy Magazine, FMSF, and it hasn't been officially announced, but I'm allowed to say that I have an epic fantasy trilogy coming out with Orbit, starting in 2025.
Hi, I'm Justin Lee Anderson, author of Carpe Diem and The Lost War, which is the first book in the Eden Saga, and book 2, The Bitter Crown, is out in December.
Hi, I'm Steve Nairn. I have 6 books with a mage in the title, that's why I'm on this panel. I'm also the author of The Coward and the Warrior, duology, and my new trilogy, The Juice Blossoms, has started, and that's historic fantasy with some magic, but the early ones have more magic in, so that is why I'm here.
Thank you, and I am your moderator. I am Hesper Leverett. I've written fantasy and science fiction short stories. The latest one is going to be out in the British the BSFA award-winning magazine Interzone hopefully next month. That's a science fiction story, but I have written a few fantasy stories as well, which you can read on Lunar Station Quarterly and in a couple of different anthologies. So, without further ado. So, my first question is, what are some of your really foundational texts, so sort of books that you read at a formative age that have really influenced the way you think about magic and the way you write about magic? So I'll ping that question to the end first, I think, to Stephen.
I didn't remember this question. We have been pre-sent them and some of them I can remember. I read a lot of Dragonlance growing up, but Tolkien read that, and David Gemmell and David Eddings and Terry Brooks, but I think the most informative for me was Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, because they started with Dragonlance, but then they went and did things like Deathgate Cycle with tattoo magic, which we now see in follow-ons and similar things that Peter Brett has done with glyphs and tattoos. But Deathgate Cycle, tattoo and glyph magic, Dragonlance with the mages, then Weiss and Hickman did the Dark Sword trilogy, where one kind of negates magic, but everyone else has magic. So those are kind of the early things for me. Terry Brooks and Weiss and Hickman, yeah.
Cool. And coming this way to Justin.
Okay, so that's really, because the thing I was going to mention is the thing that got me really into fantasy when I was about 12 was Piers Anthony. And I was going to mention the fact that what I found interesting was that they had this thing where everybody could do magic except one character, and he was the main character. I was like, oh, that's a theme, isn't it? That's I mean, I read Piers Anthony voraciously when I was a teenager. I went through all the Xanth stuff up to a point when it started to get a little bit creepy. And then Apprentice Adept, I loved. What's the other series? The Incarnations of Immortality. So all of that just kind of really got me into it. And then I started reading stuff like Rogers Lasney, I read a bit of Terry Brooks. But yeah, those are what really got me hooked on fantasy as a kid.
Mine are the two that probably everyone else has, which is Lord of the Rings and Narnia. I think that's from when I was youngest. I think the series that most got me into fantasy actually doesn't have a lot of magic in it. I think it's called the Empire series. It was a spin-off of Magician, Gianni Mertz and Raymond D. Feist. I remember reading that in the 90s, and it made a huge impression on me, I think because of the politics, which is totally off topic because it's supposed to be about magic. And I'm someone that likes complex magic systems, but I think that was, in terms of foundational texts, that's definitely one for me.
Sorry, I was just going to say, it's interesting you say, oh, it's the same as everyone else, but actually,
neither
of the other panelists mentioned Narnia.
I did read Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe as a kid.
I did read.
I mean, I also read Narnia at a young age, but it's not quite foundational for me in the same way that my answer to that question is Diana Wynne Jones. I absolutely love Diana Wynne Jones's books as a child and indeed as an adult. And also looking sort of slightly further back, the E. Nesbit books, things like Five Children and It. And I really love that sort of it's sort of slightly everyday, sort of slightly folklore-y style of magic, where it's kind of, it's less sort of like I'm going to throw a huge fireball, and it's more about like interaction with everyday objects and all that sort of stuff. And I really love the way it's sort of integrated with the world, and it doesn't always work out quite how you expected it to. Like anyone who's read Five Children of It will remember that the creature, the Samyad, grants wishes, but it's very much a book-long, like, be careful what you wish for story, because like they wish for a load of money, and they get these like obscure gold coins that like no one in the shops is like, well, what the hell is this? You know, you can't spend this here. And so it's funny, but it is a sort of like example of like, you know, magic can be unpredictable, and you can't always rely on it doing exactly what you expect it to do.
Another one I just thought of because we're talking about it, Ursula Le Guin with the Earthsea books, because we talked about more hard magic systems, some of them, but hers was a lot more softer. It wasn't as quantified, but that was also an early influence for sure.
Yeah, she has that whole thing about like the knowing something's true name, and how like, you know, revealing your true name to someone else is like the ultimate sort of trust thing that you can do, isn't it?
Yeah.
Also, it's actually a really good range of different foundational texts there. So,
Are we allowed to say TV shows as well?
yeah.
Because in the 80s, the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon.
Oh yeah.
I have to mention it because yeah, it was.
An acrobat.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. The thing is, it was really rare to have a black woman on a cartoon, so that was part of why I loved it so much. And I didn't consciously have that thought at the time. It's only looking back that I was like, oh, why did I love that so? When I look back and I can't think of any other characters of colour in those cartoons. The other one is Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, which was I think 81, 82. And that I loved because they had and I know, like, I don't know, we can have a whole conversation about whether superheroes are magic or science fiction.
I think they're magic, you know, just laying
that's
that
what
out
I
there.
think
Yeah.
as well. They had this sort of transforming flat that they lived in. It was Spider-Man.
I'm not sure what I was doing on Saturday mornings in the 80s, but I'm not in any of these cartoons.
No, that one, that's another one. I think that was something that, looking back, I really enjoyed, and I think it got me onto things like working as a team and stuff like that. So I lost my train of thought there, but yeah, I wanted to add those two.
Cool. So, what are some contemporary authors, other than yourselves, who use magic in interesting ways? Let's start with Justin this time.
Sure. So I was thinking about this, and there's two that sprang to mind when I was thinking about this, and the first one was, like everybody will know, is Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn system. I think I really found that to be unique when I first read it. It was like, oh, this is cool. Like, you have to eat or drink metal in order to power your magic. Like, that's a really cool mechanism for limiting the scope of what you can do and making it sort of not, you know, ridiculously overpowered. And I really like that. And the other one that came to mind was the Eaters from the first Law series, because they're just so, when you understand where their power comes from, they become so much more horrific.
So that's Joe Abercrombie.
Yeah, Sarah Jo Abercrombie, yeah. And you know, you've got Vyaz, whose power is all very kind of like mysterious and all you know, can do pretty much anything, but we don't really know what he can do. But when you've got the Eaters, we know that they're basically cannibals, and that's where the power comes from. It's like, that's a really interesting and quite horrific, creepy basis upon which that they become scarier because of that.
I was going to say, also there's a big price to pay for their magic. I think it's hinted at, I mean, I don't want to spoil it, but at the end of the trilogy, something really bad happens to quite a lot of people, and it's something like the consequences of the magic they've done. I really like that because of it as well.
Evan, are you ready now?
Yeah. Sort of. We haven't touched on urban fantasy yet. There's a lot of new series in the last 20 years or so that I've read, like Mike Carey's Felix Castabooks, which has magic to do with music, which was really interesting. You get into like Ben Aronovich, who's done magic where he's the only person on the force who can do, in the Metropolitan Police Force, who's a wizard in modern day. And it's just, I think his original pitch was, what if Harry Potter grew up and joined the Met? That was his kind of original pitch for Rivers of London, and then it's like...
That's pretty accurate, actually.
Yeah, and then he finds out there's one other person who can do magic who's like his mentor, and it's really odd because everyone else just thinks it's complete nonsense. It's not like some of the urban fantasy where there's things creeping around the edges and people are kind of aware of it. It's like, it's very much modern day, and people are like, don't be stupid, it's all fake, it's not real.
Yeah,
And like,
who's the character
actually,
who refers to magic as weird bollocks? It's one of the
Yeah.
other like old police guys.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like, oh, this
nice
is
and
more
good.
weird bollocks. This is your problem.
It's just that weird thing of putting it through the lens of we're so used to in some fantasy worlds where magic's just part of accepted, whereas in our world today it's like, don't be stupid, it's just smoke and mirrors, it's sleight of hand, and it's like, well, not really in some cases.
Yeah, I think for me, one writer I think is doing really cool stuff is Frances Harding, who I think of as the heir to Diana Wynne Jones. You've probably seen the theme already here. And again, it's the use of sort of like elements of like folklore and fairy tales spun in like really cool and interesting ways. Like her latest book, Unraveller, is all about curses, and there's a character who can unravel curses. But he can only do it if he understands like who's placed the curse and why they've placed it and all this sort of stuff. So it's very up close and personal, and each curse is unique to the cursor and the cursee. So you get things like someone who gets turned into a fish, and by a fisherman who's been annoyed that this guy's been telling him he can't fish in this stretch of canal, and he's like, I'm going to turn you into a fish and then I'm going to fish you. Yeah. So, how would you describe the way you use magic in your own writing? Let's start next to you,
I think
Oh, wow.
I think it varies. So in my short fiction, I tend to be more focused. I don't know if everyone's read Babel by R.F. Kuang. Love the magic system in that.
That is a fantastic magic system. I love that.
And I think the reason I particularly love it is because of the subtext. There's a few different ways you can read what magic symbolises in that book. In short fiction, I tend to try and create magic systems like that, where they're serving a purpose for me to do with whatever it is I'm trying to say in that story. So one of my short stories was about loss of culture that comes from being a conquered people, and in that one the conquerors have a magic where they can steal words from the language of the people they conquer. So that's quite specific, whereas in my long fiction I tend to sort of favour more complex magic systems. That's what I enjoy reading. So I won't necessarily try and make it serve the second purpose of being sort of symbolic of something else. I mean, in my trilogy, I have technology as magic. It's a sort of lost technology that is perceived to be magic. So I think I like it to be quite, we were talking about Sanderson, I really like the magic system in Stormlight. It's quite complicated. I'm not sure I fully understand all of it, but I like discovering.
Yeah, I think that's one thing Sanderson does really well, isn't it? Is that he doesn't sort of lay out the magic system right at the outset. You sort of, you and the characters understand some of it, and then over the course of the story, you understand more and more of it.
Yeah. That's the end.
So what I've done in the Eden Saga is I wanted to treat magic as a bit like science is treated in the real world. So what I've got is I use Gaelic as my magic language. So you've got Drai, which is basically a bad pronunciation of the Gaelic word for druid, which is their word for wizard. And there are different kind of skills that people can be born with, and then they have to learn how to use them. So you've got like an earth Drai who is essentially like an elemental mage, but they can also control gravity. There's metamorphs. There are, think about what they all are now. There's nature Drais who can basically control plants, but also the more advanced ones can communicate with animals as well. So there's like 6 or 7 different skills that they can have. But how I've treated it is that there are limitations because they use their own physical energy in order to use the magic. So they're actually limited by how much they have to rest, and they have to recuperate before they can use more. So they literally drain themselves when they do it. But also in the way that I've treated it like science is like they don't know everything. So they're constantly finding out new things about it, and there's like, there's a major university in the country that one of the things it does is study magic to try and find new things that they can do with it. There are hypothesized skills that have been thought about. There are skills that maybe one person is recorded to have had 100 years ago that they haven't seen anybody with for a long time. And so I wanted to be very kind of like, oh, we're learning about this, we're learning new things, we don't know everything. and every now and again something new comes up and it changes our understanding of what magic is and can do. And I'm really enjoying playing with it, like, because it creates limits, but it also gives you the scope to then maybe throw in something new later on and change things and have them discover things that are like, oh, that'll be a cool thing, let's do that. And so that's how I treat it.
Similar to that, in my first two trilogies, Battle Mage and those ones, all magic comes from one particular thing called the source, and there are those who have, you know, the ability to throw fireballs and lightnings, and they're kind of frontier, heavy artillery mages. When there's a war, people are called in, and they're the ones that the soldiers get off the battlefield and they start fighting against each other, and then caught in the middle get torn apart. But there has to be a limit, like you said. The idea being that the source where people draw energy from is limitless, and your body's like a fuse. You can only take so much energy through yourself and channel it before the fuse snaps and your head explodes. And everyone's got a certain level of strength. But I spent a lot of time building the magic system. Other people have certain gifts that can do certain things, but all of the mages in the world are human. All the other races in the world have gifts from the source, but they're not interpreted as magic in the same way. So there's one race that have sort of like 7 lives or 9 lives, like a cat essentially. It can get near death several times and recuperate. There's another race I've made up that is incredibly tough, like physical damage. There again, it's their gift from the source, but nobody interprets it as magic because it's inherent to that race. They're just like, we're the toughest, we're the strongest, and like, why? And so I spent a lot of time thinking about the why and how and where did it come from. So there's overt and there's more hidden magic. In the Juice Blossom, because it's historical fantasy, there is a small bit of magic, but it's not the main focus. And one of the characters is exposed to something. I'm trying to avoid something. There's more of it in the rest of the series from one character, but it isn't the focus from this series. But the other ones, the mage in the title, you kind of know what you're getting. There's a lot more open magic.
So that segues nicely to the next question, which is, do you think that magic is an essential part of fantasy fiction? Does a story need to have magic in it to be considered fantasy?
No.
Which is interesting. I looked into the panel on defining fantasy a few years ago, and it was like, what is your criteria for fantasy? And mine was magic.
Sorry, go on.
No, you have.
Every crime novel, every other kind of novel you can think of is fantasy, because if they had the murder rates of any DI so-and-so book in that town, Murder, She Wrote, it would be worse than Chicago in like Al Capone Day. It's complete fantasy, you know. Like one of these super murder cases comes up once in a career sometimes for most cops, it's fantasy. So I don't think what we would consider fantasy has to have magic in it.
That's fascinating. I've heard people claim argue that science fiction is a subcategory of fantasy, but I've never heard crime brought into fantasy before.
pick any genre. Romance. How much is going on in every book? Wow, that's a lot of behind closed doors action. So sounds like fantasy.
What you're saying is fiction is fantasy, basically.
That's what I was going to say. All fiction comes from fantasy, in my opinion. All of it is mutant fantasy. I think partly because the origin of storytelling is often folklore and legend and myth, which is all fantasy. So I always think they're the mutant genres and we're the OG. For me, fantasy, as others have said, it doesn't have to include magic, but I tend to need magic of some sort. I mean, I read a lot of science fiction as well, and although I do read some fantasy with not much magic in, for my personal tastes, I like to have it, but I don't think it has to be there to be classed as fantasy as we usually define it.
Is supernatural fantasy, like supernatural elements, like ghosts and things? So when I was in high school, I got told off for reading Dragonbone Chair in the back of a class when we were reading Shakespeare. Now I would have pointed out to the teacher, hang on, there's ghosts in this, and there's witches. Dude, it's the same. But
yeah,
I was 15.
That's an example of that sort of weird phenomenon where sometimes books get shelved in places where you kind of think, well, why have you put that there? And I think ghost stories are an excellent example, that ghost stories often get shelved sort of like with like the literary fiction and stuff. And you say, well, ghosts, aren't they like a supernatural element? And okay, you can argue about whether ghosts are real or not, but assuming that they are a supernatural thing, shouldn't that be with fantasy? But the readership for it isn't necessarily like going to be looking in the fantasy section, so it's more based on like who they think is going to be interested in reading this book than anything to do with like what the actual content is.
It's how they market it. The Time Traveller's Wife was shelved in bookshops in fiction, and like there's a clue in the title that it's science fiction, but they wouldn't read a science fiction book, but they would read The Time Traveller's Wife.
Yeah, and there's a book a few years ago, I don't know if anyone's read it, called Binding by Bridget Collins. And this was marketed as a literary fiction book, and I read it, and it's a secondary world fantasy with magic as like the central plot element, and yet it's not with the fantasy, it's with like the literary fiction. But this was, you know, the people who were marketing this book decided that it would appeal to like this base of literary fiction readers, and so that's where it got shelved.
But that's basically the case for all genre definitions, isn't it? They only exist in order to point readers at the stuff they want. Pretty much, you know. But I'm the same. I tend to want magic in fantasy, and I think the other thing that would make it still fantasy, to my mind, would be like otherworldly creatures, you know, like other life forms that are not, you know, of this world. Basically, I think if you've got either one of those, but predominantly, yeah, I'm looking for some kind of magical, fantastical element to consider a fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have necessarily said to myself, you know, oh, I love mythical creatures, I'm a mythical creatures person. And yet when I was sort of like looking through the stories that I've had published, I'm like, well, there's a mermaid story, and there's a unicorn story, and there's a dragon story. Yeah. So I obviously do in fact have a thing about mythical creatures, but I'm slightly in denial. But yeah. Anyway, so moving on. So why should you include magic in your story? What does magic give you in your story that just technology can't? Justin?
Thank you. I think magic is kind of like, for me, I think going back is like, it's almost like wish fulfillment, because like magic's like the big leveler. It's like the characters who are not physically strong. I think, you know, I'm now like 6'3" and 16 stone, but as a kid I was quite small and quite skinny, and I remember as a kid being like, you know, God, I hate being this small, and I'm, you know, getting picked on and stuff. But magic is the thing that levels it. Like for characters who are not physically strong and capable of physically dominating other people, magic is the thing that gives them the power instead. And that's kind of, it is kind of like, it's a power that comes from within you, and that's skill rather than just an accident of, you know, physical development. And I think that's, for me, I think that's where it kind of, like my main character is substantially less physically fit than all the warriors and stuff that are around him, because he doesn't need to be, because he doesn't carry a weapon, he doesn't need to be physically fit, because he has this completely other skill, and for me that's kind of the interesting thing about it, I think.
I guess, I suppose for me, it's the sense of wonder. It's the same thing that I like in science fiction. The science fiction I like, do we say big dumb object anymore? I don't know.
We can do.
I like that trope in science fiction, and I think for me with magic it's the same thing. It's the potential, it's the wonder, the not knowing. I suppose, yeah, I think that's the main one for me.
Following what Justin was saying, Grace Lynn Magia from the Raglands books. He's incredibly frail. His twin brother is really, really strong and big. Yet he's the most dangerous of all of them because he's incredibly powerful, and his power to use magic comes from his will, and his will is the strongest. His brother's terrified him, everyone else is terrified him, but he's incredibly frail. He drinks his tea all the time, he's coughing all the time, and he's close to death all the time. But he's probably the most dangerous character out of all of them, and it's just all down to magic. He's not physically strong at all, but he can do amazing things that nobody else can. And it's that sense of wonder, as you say. Technology is quantifying something and boiling it down and repeatable and the same thing every time. And magic has that. It doesn't always work the way you think it's going to, and it can go far beyond what technology can do, I would say. It's just that sense of magic can be anything. Technology, it's the same thing every time you do it. It's the same thing, and it just gets a bit, it's not as interesting for me as magic.
So we talk a lot about magic systems, but does magic need to have a system? You know, do you need to have the sort of Brandon Sanderson style hard magic system in order to tell a satisfying story, or does that suck the wonder out of it?
depends what type of story you're telling.
It depends who your character is, I think, as well.
Like Ged in the Earthsea books, we don't understand how that works, but the books are full of wonder and full of mystery and full of all sorts of really, really cool things. If you create a hard magic system and you have a structure, there has to be limits, because otherwise magic is the ultimate MacGuffin for any story. Someone gets in trouble, they wave their hand, magic solves it, so there has to be a structure of some kind. You mentioned Peter McLean. His books, in his War for the Rose Throne, there are people called cunning people. And most people are terrified, and most people think their power comes from the devil or whatever it might be. But no one really knows how it works. And I said to him once, do you know how it works behind the scenes? Is a little but not a lot. Because he doesn't want to know. So when the reader reads it, they get this kind of weird, creepy feeling from these people, and the characters are responding in the same way. And he hasn't quantified it, but we understand there's a limit. We understand that the characters just can't do anything all of the time. So he's built that into his head, even with having a soft magic system. So I don't think you need to quantify it all the time. As you say, it's type of story, type of character, type of world you're building.
I can't remember who it was. It's someone well known who said that the more magic you have, the better explained it has to be. If it's going to be, the more mysterious it is, the less well explained you need to make it. And I understand why, because the more you have magic in your story, if you don't understand the rules, the tension is lost, because you might feel that anything can happen. But I do think it is possible to have a book with a lot of magic that is still quite mysterious. I think it's how it's handled. That's a bit of a tangent, but
I think, for me, the way I thought about it is, if you have a point of view character who uses magic, you need to have rules, because they have to know what they are, and they have to understand it in themselves. So I think if you're writing from the point of view of a magic user, it doesn't necessarily make sense to just be able to do anything and not have them kind of have a basic understanding of rules. If you're writing, if your point of view characters are non-magic users and you've got another character who's a magic user, you can absolutely get away with a soft system, because if they don't understand it, for them it's wonder, and they don't, you know, as you were saying, it's like it's wonder, and they don't understand, they don't know what to be done. So I think it depends whose point of view you're writing from.
I would sort of slightly disagree with that, in as much as I think you can have a point of view character who uses magic, who doesn't actually know what they're doing, and I think that can be an interesting source of tension.
That's fair.
An example that springs to mind is Robin Hobb's Assassin's Apprentice, that Farseer series.
The wit and the skill.
Yeah, where it has the wit and the skill, and the main character has access to these two different types of magic, and they interact sometimes in slightly weird ways. And there are scenes where he's doing something and he doesn't really know what he's doing, and it's quite sort of like frightening and thrilling to read, because he's getting carried away of using a skill, and you know, without revealing everything that happens.
There's still limits, because we understand there's a cost to the skill.
Yeah, there's definitely a cost to
the
this.
wit.
There's definitely a cost to what he's doing, but he doesn't quite know where those limits are and how to handle them, and that makes it that sort of sense of he's not quite in control. I think that makes that book stronger than if he was like a skilled user of the skill and knew exactly what he was doing.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily mean that they have to completely understand it, but we have to get some sense from them of what's happening. Basically, you can't just have it all be hand wavy. I think if you're writing from their perspective, basically.
Yeah.
So do you think it is important to have like costs and limitations on magic, even if it's a relatively soft magic system?
Yeah, there has to be. Otherwise, it is the ultimate fix-all for any problem in a story. Magic just becomes wave your hands, and whatever the problem is, you fixed it. That's just not interesting for storytelling. For readers, will just get bored. Anytime there's an issue, just, yeah, I fixed it, there we go. There's no tension, there's no thrill.
Yeah. If the magic doesn't have limits, I was thinking Captain Marvel is a good example of this, because for all the misogyny behind complaining about her being overpowered, Marvel had to spend a lot of time writing her out of stories so that she couldn't just come in and fix everything. And that's kind of where you write yourself into a corner. If you've got somebody who's like godlike power, you then have to have a godlike threat in order to give that story tension. So your characters have to have limits, so that basically there's tension, so there's a story there. Or otherwise you're going to have to write in artificial plot devices as to why they didn't just fix that and fix that.
I'm just thinking of different magic systems, again with Babel, and also I'm thinking of the Greenbone Saga, them to do with sort of resources. So I think that can sometimes sometimes be the limit, although those two magic systems, there's not the sort of hand-wavy stuff that we just described. That doesn't really happen. There is the sense of discovery that I think someone mentioned earlier about almost like scientific discovery magic. There's that sense, I think, with both those magic systems that are sort of handled almost like technology in some ways. And I was thinking, are there any limits in the Greenbone saga to what a Greenbone could do?
So
if
that's
they were skilled
by
enough?
Fondley,
Sorry,
the
by Fondley.
Jade City, Jade Legacy.
And I was thinking when I was reading it, I feel like there aren't if you were skilled enough, but because it's a physical resource that they have to actually mine, in some ways that makes it limited. So I suppose there needs to be something, but it doesn't necessarily, I feel, need to be the magic system or the magic user. It could be some other way in which it's limited. I guess I'm thinking about it being a resource.
Yeah, I sort of, I don't, well, I suppose I am disagreeing. Let's just lean into it. I am disagreeing a little bit, which is that I think that you can write a satisfactory story with extremely overpowered characters, but the crucial thing is that, you know, they can do extremely powerful magic, but that in order to have an interesting story, they have to have problems that magic can't solve. And the example from fantasy literature would be something like the Magician series by Lev Grossman, which I kind of think of, it's kind of like, what if Narnia was real and Hogwarts was real and you could do awesome magic, but it didn't actually solve any of your problems because you're still depressed? And a real life example, I'm sorry for mentioning Elon Musk, but he's an example of someone who has like a real life magical power, i.e. basically unlimited money. Has that solved all his problems? I don't get the impression that it has, actually. You know, he's
got hair implants, better teeth.
It's created a lot of problems for the rest of us.
Yeah, it's created a lot of problems for everyone else, but he doesn't give me an impression of being a man who is 100% like happy and like lives his life in a state of zen-like calm, you know. So I think you can write an interesting story with overpowered characters, but you just have to throw problems at them that their powers can't solve. So the problems don't necessarily have to be caused by limits on their powers. It has to be caused by something else. And so moving into a slightly different question, which is limitations on who can use magic. So for example, is it something that you're either a muggle or a magic user, or is it something that anyone can use if they practice enough, like playing the piano? In theory, anyone can play the piano, but you have to practice to be any good at it. Or another approach would be that anyone could do it in theory, but there's some sort of real cost that you have to pay. So I know there's a couple of book series where the example is, in order to use magic, you have to sacrifice your ability to have children. What do you think about that?
I think it depends on what story you're telling, which is a really vague answer, isn't it? But no, so, I mean, for example, it depends what's your underlying story is. I guess it's not what you expressed, but like what are you trying to get at underneath? So, for example, in my world, it's a limited number of people who are born with a proclivity for a skill, and the reason that it's a limited number of people is because one of the things I wanted to explore was prejudice, and so you know that it's a limited number of people, and people are afraid of them, and therefore they're prejudiced against them, and therefore they're powerful, but they're kind of hated by society and they're treated really badly. Yeah. Because that was a storyline I wanted to investigate and play with. And so, so that's why I did it that way. But equally, as we were talking about, you know, there's lots of people who've done worlds where everybody does magic, and then the unusual thing is that you've got a character who doesn't, or who's going to be immune to it, and that's kind of their ability. So it depends, I think, how you set up, who can use magic, depends on what it is you're trying to do, kind of underneath the main story, I think.
Mine mirrors Justin's in some ways, my Battle Mage books, in that there are a limited number of people who can do it, but it's not tied by bloodline, it's not tied by a particular type of person, and therefore there is a lot of fear. The first book, Battle Mage, is all about an enormous war, and therefore they're required to have battle mages in that war, because if the other army doesn't have it, the war is over. So there has to be some kind of balance. But equally, so they're hated and feared. My approach was, we all know that, you know, Darren Brown and however many magicians you want to name they can't actually do magic. It's a skill, it's learned, it's techniques, it's sleight of hand. But if magic was actually real and you met someone who could actually summon lightning, you'd run in the opposite direction, because they'd be terrifying. Even if they tried to explain how they did what they did, and you walked up to them in the street, your hair stand upon end. So I had that fear and that prejudice. And someone else sees this happening and all these problems are caused from this war, and their idea is, if you kill everybody who's got magic, you'll get rid of all the bloodlines, you'll get rid of magic. But it doesn't happen that way. So that fear of hunting down children in a later book who exhibit signs of magic, and that ties into, you know, when are they coming of age? Does it come with puberty and this sort of thing? So it's fear and prejudice, and I explored similar themes in my books around that kind of thing. Yes, it's not everybody who can do it. It's not a skill that anybody can have.
Yeah, I think approaching it that way is good, because I think it's much more common to have only certain people can do magic, but I guess as someone that's a little bit obsessed with class, I don't like the idea that only certain people, whether it's because they've got a great like knowledge, academic knowledge of magic, or whether it's because they've got an innate ability with their blood, or just the way that nature sometimes selects randomly. I think it's much more common to have those kind of magic systems, but I like the idea that if everyone had the opportunity, they could all do magic, just because I think if you do it in that limited way, you kind of have to address the things that you guys were talking about to do with prejudice. And often I feel, or maybe in certainly the more classic books that I've read, often that isn't addressed. And to me, that's saying all these things about classism and prejudice. So it's good now that those things are part of magic system. I think they have to be. I think it's harder to write a magic system where everyone can do magic, because there's, as you say, there's got to be some limit, or the story will just run away with you. But I like it when the idea is explored that you don't have to be of a certain bloodline or have a certain amount of education in order to do it.
Yeah, I'm with you there. My book that I'm currently writing, which is like, I bill it as a Cold War spy thriller with magic, and it's this idea that like the magic users are this like very sort of small and elite group within the Secret Service, and traditionally only sort of very like aristocratic people with like a specific family and their sort of like friends who are like the magic users, and then gradually over, it's certainly like early Cold War, and they're realising that to counter the threat from the Soviets, who have a much more egalitarian approach to who can use magic. Who'd have thought the communists would do it that way? They're realising they're going to have to like recruit more people who can do magic, and so part of like the tensions in the stories with the aristocratic characters who are like, oh, we're going to have to recruit some like working class people who can do magic, and they're like, no, working class people can't do magic. Like, yeah, and we've even got some like people of colour who can do magic as well. Like, what? And the aristocrats are like, you know, their heads are exploding at this concept, but it's about that idea of trying to like, you know, expand this pool of people who can do magic beyond this sort of like core of posh people, basically.
There's you reminded me of another series I really like is the Gilded Cage series by Vic James, and it's like an alternate history. Like it's an alternate modern day, but with a massive alternate history where people come up who can use magic, and they basically become the ruling class. Like anybody who can use magic becomes the ruling class, and everybody who can has to like do 10 years service working for them. And it's a really it's really interesting series because it's culture has like stayed almost Victorian in many ways, but it's set in modern day. And I kept forgetting I wasn't reading like basically a Jane Eyre novel with magic in it. And it's just a really interesting take on it, that basically if you can do magic, you are therefore the ruling class, and everybody else is underneath.
Oh, right. In order to have enough time for questions from the audience, I'm going to skip over a few of these questions and go to what is a crucial piece of advice you would give to anyone who is writing about magic?
My advice, personally, I think even if your magic system, or you might have a magic system, but even if the way magic works in your world isn't clear in the story, I think it's good to have it clear in your mind. Even if you haven't got all the pieces of the puzzle, just having more information in your mind than you put forward on the page, I think always helps. That's one piece of advice.
Yeah,
I was going to say that.
Oh, that's our way first.
But that is really good advice. That's what I was thinking as well.
But we've all got world Bibles, haven't we? There's more stuff on all my books about all aspects of it. in notes that will appear on the page, and it's the same for magic systems. So whether it's a hard magic system or a soft magic system, as long as you know something about it, and you've got a system, and you've poked holes in it. So if someone says, "Oh, why can't they just do this and solve all the problems?" You've gone through that, or you had someone beta read it for you, or just kind of role play it, even like you've done with yours, and explain like, "Well, why didn't you just do that?" Like, oh, right, and then you find the loophole and fix it, so that when you write the proper story, it doesn't just all fall apart. But yeah, whether it's hard or soft magic system, build some kind of structure, some kind of framework, even if you never explain it properly.
That's, I actually came across the why didn't they just, when I was going through one of the last edits of my new book that's coming out in December, and I was like, oh God, have I left a massive plot? Why didn't she just do that? And I had to go over and like go, oh no, it's okay because I'd established that before, and that's the reason why she did. It's fine. But I did have that moment of panic of, oh my God, nobody has thought of this plot hole in all the edits.
I wonder though, like in life, people make mistakes, and I think, you know, you get that in any story, you get that in horror all the time. Why didn't they just do X? And it's because they're teenagers usually, and teenagers don't think so straight most of the time. And I wonder if it would be nice to apply that to fantasy and magic systems as well. Oh, they just didn't think of it because they're human, or maybe not human, but, you know, fallible in the way that everything is. It would be nice to apply that as well, but I know we don't.
I love that. So one of my main characters suffers from depression, and I've had people say, he makes really bad decisions. I'm like, yes. He's depressed, and depressed people make really bad decisions. That's kind of what we do. So I was like, yes, what you haven't recognised is that's just character.
Yeah, magic doesn't fix the depression.
Exactly.
Magic doesn't fix their health, whatever it might be. Yeah.
Okay, let's have some questions from the audience.
I think one of the things that's really interesting about Brandon Sanderson's laws of magic is that he's obviously talking about you have to have some sort of limitation. And if you've ever heard him speak about it, it goes like the kind of like lazy limitation is, oh, they get tired afterwards. So what's the most interesting limitation that you've read in a book? Or that sounds particularly novel, for example? Because there's like a lot that are very similar to each other, aren't they? Like it's a resource they haven't got, or it physically tires you out.
I mean, I'll go back to the eaters, and like they have to eat another person. That's a pretty good limitation. You have to literally just commit to being a cannibal for the rest of your life. That's a pretty big limitation.
Yeah.
That's
It's a big ask.
I can't think of a better one than that.
No.
I can think of one I enjoyed, which is, oh my gosh, I think it's called A Song of Shattered Sands.
Bradley Bollier.
Yeah.
Yeah. Song of Shattered Sands.
That has blood magic in it, and there's a sort of slightly villainous character in that series, not I think in the first book, maybe book 2 or 3, who does black magic too much, and she ends up really weak and really thin, and from using the blood too much. And I really liked, that was like a very visceral reading experience for me, and I really liked that that particular limitation. So I suppose in blood magic, the idea that you're physically making yourself ill by doing it.
I can't really think of many that we haven't really touched on.
So there's one, does anyone listen to the podcast World Building for Masochists? Yeah. If you don't listen to it, you definitely should. And they have this concept which was introduced to them by Kate Elliott, and is now like a major part of this sort of collaborative world they're building together, which is the concept of, they call it the magical nude gate. And it's these portals which are like an instantaneous form of transportation all around the world. But the catch is, so you cannot take anything with you at all. And hence the magical nude gate, you pop through, you are absolutely butt naked. And they're actually doing an anthology. And I think submissions are open now, so if you've got some short fiction inspired by the concept of the magical nude gate, go for it. And they talk about what impacts this has, and one thing which I think is funny is the idea of like someone who's coming through with some really urgent news is like coming through, and there's someone standing there with like the bathrobe to put on, and they're like, oh no, I've got to see the king immediately, and running off, and going through the halls of the palace butt naked, like, oh, it's a naked spy, this is an urgent piece of news. And I think that's it. Yeah, obviously it's kind of funny, the idea of people running around naked, but it is also an interesting thing to think about, and they have examples of things like having tattoos as a sort of like form of credit, because obviously you can't take your money with you. So you'd have like a tattoo from a bank in one part of the world, which then means your credit is good at the bank in another part of the world. And I think that's a really, really cool idea.
That's interesting. I've done similar with my metamorphs in my world, where like it never made sense to me that metamorphs came back from being animals with clothes on. So like anytime a metamorph changes back into their human form, they are just butt naked and they need to go find some clothes.
Well, yeah, so it's like the Hulk. Why is he wearing trousers? Yeah.
Yeah.
Always stretchy pants.
Yeah.
Stretchy trousers.
Lycra is his form.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm done. Right, more questions? Yes?
What do you think of books that have many types of magic in them? Very, very different, say, like Stephen Erickson's Malazan series. Do you think you could write books about juggling so many different forms of magic?
I think again, I mean the world building in Malazan is obviously like really in depth and massive, and so I think again it depends on the context of the story you're writing. But yeah, absolutely. I think if you can make it work, great. As long as you don't write yourself into a corner where you're suddenly like, oh, now what can I do next to have any story here, because anything I want to be fixed can just be fixed. So yeah, it depends on the story, but in a really complex world like that, absolutely.
As you mentioned, Bradley Bowley has done it in his Song of the Shattered Sands. He's got 3 different types of magic system. I spoke to him, explained, I said like, how do you did it? And he'd spent a lot of time. They don't connect, the 3 different magic systems, and one's blood magic, one's something to do with something else. I don't want to spoil the third one, but they all have very different effects, very different costs, very different structures. So you can have it because the sources are different. So it's not pulling from the same thing, but you could have different interpretations, and you wouldn't know that it's come from the same source. So it really depends on how you build the systems within your world, I think. It's possible, yeah.
I mean, I really like that. I like it when there's lots of different magic systems, especially when it's tied to culture, because I think magic in different cultures, all cultures have some concept of magic and it's different in each of them. So I think it would make sense if you have actual magic in your world for them to be different. And I think it's also a useful way to separate the cultures in your world. I think it's harder to pull off. I mean, we readers of this kind of fantasy tend to like our really long books, and you need a lot of word count in order to get those things across. So I think the difficult part is trying to fit it in a word count that is acceptable if you're not Brandon Sanderson. But I really like having different magic systems, and I think it's a very useful tool, and you know, it's done really well in Shattered Sands. I forgot about that. I just remember the blood magic.
Yeah, to pick up what you were saying about different cultures, you know, I think that's a really excellent point, because you know there are so many different cultures in the world, and each culture does things slightly differently, and like so everyone eats food, but like different foods in different parts of the world are completely and utterly different, and part of that's just to do with like what plants grow in that area, but part of it's not. And also like languages, you know, all human mouths work in the same way, but like different languages in different parts of the world, you know, they're using the same sort of system of like tongue and lips and teeth, but they use completely different sounds. Like the Southern African languages use like the click sounds, and each language has like, you know, if you've ever sort of studied like non-Indo-European languages, you know, they have like incredibly different structures and incredibly different ways of expressing concepts. So I find the idea that magic would work the same way all over the world quite sort of why. You know, languages are different, food's different, you know, people's like the way people dress is different, the way people sort of structure their society is different. Why would magic be the same? So I think that's you know, there are obvious, like you're saying about like how long's the book going to be, you know, perhaps, you know, you have to sort of take a few shortcuts, but I love the idea of magic working differently in different societies, and I especially love the idea of potentially magic works differently in different parts of the world. We've got a 5-minute warning. And so perhaps you have one person who's learned to do magic in one place, and then they go to a different part of the world, and suddenly like, oh, this isn't working. And maybe that's because, I know, a different type of bedrock produces a different magical effect, or magnetic fields are different, or something like that. But that concept, I've got to write something about this at some point, because I love this idea of like, you go to a different place and I guess an analogy would be like, you know, you move from one culture to another culture, you're trying to cook your food, but you can't get hold of the ingredients, you end up sort of like mashing something together that's sort of an approximation.
Well, it's the time magic's interpreted. You go to the Wheel of Time books, it's all from the same source, but then you've got the people, the women do it in one way, the men can't do it because of the poison, but then you get the Sean Chan that come in and enslave magic users and things. So it's the same source, but they view it completely differently, and so it feels like it's different magic systems, but we actually know behind the scenes it's the same. So
that's exactly what I was going to say. There's a distinction to be made between magic where there is, as you say, one source, actually one source in this case, and magic like Shattered Sands where there's actual different systems.
Yeah, distinct systems.
But I think if you have one source, it is nice to have it interpreted in different ways by different cultures or different groups of people in whatever way it's divided up. So
I think we've got time for one more question.
Okay, could you just repeat, you were talking about magic as music before, could you just repeat what that was?
Mike Carey, Felix Castor novels. So it's to do with spirits and demonology, but also music is a part of the Castor novels.
That was a quick question, so we've probably got time for
Urban
one more.
fantasy.
I think there's a book called Rhapsody as well. I haven't actually read it. I've read it in his music. Might be worth looking up.
I've only read Barb Coyle by J.B. Jones.
Oh,
It's a
yes.
standalone. Music, sorry, it's painting and colour
Yeah.
is magic. And it's 5 minutes, thanks. And
We
it's
already
the
had
most
5 minutes.
original system I've ever read for magic that she did. This is a one-off.
Am I remember, isn't Empire of Sand also dance magic?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's
That's
dance
true.
magic as well, isn't it? Yeah.
Book 2 about Ben Rodovich, the jazz.
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
jazz,
Yeah.
vampires.
Yeah.
Jazz vampires, yeah.
I mean, that's a pitch in itself, isn't it? Jazz
Jazz
vampires.
vampires.
That's
Why
a pitch.
would you want to read that? It's brilliant.
Any more questions?
67 space later.
So can I just clarify, in our real world magic system, we are Elon Musk's resource?
Oh God, that's the
What an awful
Can't end on
note
that
to
note.
If you tweet about this panel, yes. If you don't, no.
Are we back to the eaters now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that came full circle
Dark.
in a dark way.
Dark.
Yeah, it did.
Well, on that horrifying note, thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for